Somehow right up here up front. I don't know how that happened. Yeah. Every denomination is a back row denomination, Ellen. Yeah, about another minute, and then we'll welcome Sherry and get started.
I like this podium with its little lip.
You can put some stuff
You can put stuff up there. It doesn't
You can
fall
put stuff up
away.
there.
Yeah. You ever studied that?
I've read it a few times, but
It's
been a few years.
It's so great.
There are moments. There are moments in that the scene where the body is starting to smell.
I'm keeping this up here
Exactly.
so that I will not
Sure.
go long.
Okay, are we on? Good morning. Good morning and welcome to Calvary, whether you're sitting here with us in the room. Hello in the back row back there. Hello. I can't see who that... No. And welcome if you're with us via live stream. We are thrilled to have this morning a dear friend of Catherine Bush's and colleague for years at St. Mary's Episcopal School. Some of you here will know that Catherine's mother died Friday afternoon, so we hold them in our prayers and our hearts today. I can't imagine that it's all the more heartening for Catherine to have her friend here with us in this place at this time, even though she wishes she could be here to really give you the personalized introduction for Sherry. But Sherry is a teacher of literature and creative writing at St. Mary's School for nearly 40 years.
40 years total teaching.
Total teaching. Total teaching, but still, you must have started as a student at St. Mary's. Sherry Brand-Ray is currently chair of the English department at St. Mary's Episcopal School. Native Memphian, she enjoys taking long walks with her husband Larry, teaching high school English, writing on her back porch while she watches the birds, neighborhood bar. Those are some of the things? Yeah, good things. Her first book, Surprised by Imperfection. Oh, that's the Karamazov thing right there. Okay, sorry, we were talking before. Surprised by Imperfection debuted in November 2022, and she has a second book of essays that's going to release this fall in 2023. Is there a title for that one yet? The working title is The Way We Spend Our Days. That was just leaked. Like nobody else knows that but us, I think. So let's welcome Sherry. Thanks for being here.
Thank you very much. Hello, y'all. Thank you so much for this invitation. Catherine Bush contacted me maybe, a couple of months ago and said, would I like to speak? And I said, yes, I always like, so yes, a hearty yes. And she said, would you please speak on the topic of resurrection motifs in literature, which is something, I was just telling Jenny Madden, something that I kind of think about. There are two students here of mine, so they can probably recognize. There's something that I think about a lot when I read literature and when I teach literature, but I don't know that I have ever, well, I do know, I have never put together actually a talk about that. And so it kind of was great to kind of stretch just a bit and figure out what it is that I want to say about that, what it is that which literature, because I have a few minutes to talk about. I have been a teacher for a long time, and so I'd love for you to ask questions or make comments along the way. Just raise your hand. I'd love that if you'll do that. If not, we'll have time for questions at the end, but it's better, I think, if you have a question or a comment along the way, or if that reminds you, something I say reminds you of something else. So I hope you'll do that like my students do. Of course, I am saddened that Catherine can't be with us here today. I think it's interesting that what she asked me to speak on was resurrection. that lovely spiritual moment's not wasted on any of us. And so we are so happy about the promise of resurrected life in our Christian tradition, aren't we? I am. And I had this already to open, so I'm just going to open with what I already had, and that is this. Jesus said unto her, I am the resurrection and the life. He that believeth in me, though he were dead, yet shall he live. And the Apostle Paul says, behold, I show you a mystery. We shall not sleep, but we shall be changed in a moment, in the twinkling of the eye, at the last trump. For the trumpet shall sound, and the dead shall be raised incorruptible, and we shall all be changed. And I'm going to argue here in a minute that that is our deepest longing. I think it is. Our deepest longing to be, to live again, to be changed, to be better, to live again. And I'm going to argue that the literature supports this premise. You can tell me what you think later. What Scott and I were talking about earlier was this book that I love so much, The Brothers Karamazov. You have to commit to it. It is not for the faint of heart. It is for those who will commit. It is long. But it is, as corny as this sounds, it's a book that really did change me, at least in considering the way he writes about a human being. But the way he opens his dedication to this book and the verse, the very first pages, is this: verily, verily, I say unto you, except a corn of wheat fall into the ground and die, it abideth alone. But if it die, it bringeth forth much fruit. And we know these things. We've heard these verses. We know these things. So I'm going to start with the idea of some thematic notions, some thematic ideas about resurrection in general, but I'll be talking more about literature than theology, although some of my theology probably will come through. You may agree or disagree, who knows? We'll see, but mostly I'm going to stick to the books. So what is the definition of resurrection? What does it mean? What we kind of all nod when we're talking about resurrection, but what does it mean? So the coming, any students? Anyone? No, it's all right. I'm not going to put them on the spot, Brennan and Chloe. Thank you for coming. It is the act of rising or coming back from the dead. And metaphorically, it is the same idea as falling and rising back up differently, changed, like baptism. Baptism in literature is interesting. Baptism in the church has its meaning. Baptism in literature is more literal. I teach my students that in real life, if you go outside in a rainstorm and get wet, you just should have remembered to bring an umbrella. But in literature, if a person goes outside in a rainstorm and stands in the rain and gets wet, that has significance. Because don't forget that literature, or at least I'm going to be talking about fiction literature today. And so that was created by someone that has meaning. And the books stay if the meaning resounds. So why are we still reading this? It was written in like 1860. Why are we still reading this? Because the meaning still resounds. Because it's got depth to it. And so these characters in literature were created for meaning. So if King Lear, I think of Shakespeare, if King Lear goes out into the storm and stands on the great abyss with his hands up and getting wet, only one of two things can happen. The best thing is that when he comes back in, he is changed, or he wants to be changed, or he starts to act differently. Sometimes we have an anti-baptism. Sometimes we have an anti-resurrection. A person is offered baptism and they refuse it. That happens. But more often than not, I guess, a person is changed after they have been baptized or after they have been resurrected. And what resurrection can look like in literature is the same thing. When I teach young children, like younger people, if a person falls down and then gets back up, they have changed. So if they're like a bad character or a villain, and they fall. And then in fiction, their creator, their writer, has them stand back up. Generally, that's good, and they become a different person. I don't want to be that way anymore. And that can happen the opposite way, too. There is, even in the Brothers Karamazov here, an anti-Lord's Supper. At the very end, Dmitri is eating and drinking and carousing, and it's all, there are priests there, and there are religious folk there, and it's all negative. There can be an anti-Lord's Supper, an anti-baptism, an anti-resurrection. But today we're going to talk about people who fall down and then get back up changed, like we hope we will, like I hope I will. So resurrection, the act of coming back from the dead, is always available. But it only comes after the death of a thing. I think that's important. Except a corn of wheat fall to the ground and die, it dies alone. But if it, how does it go? I've already forgotten it. If it does die, it brings forth much fruit. It's changed. My grandson, Teddy, sorry about talking about the garden. I always talk about Teddy. Teddy is 7 years old. He goes to Grace St. Luke's in the first grade. Go Saints. And he has decided that he and his grandfather, my husband, who we all call Lad, he wanted to start a garden. He wanted to grow a garden. And so we have a garden that we all look at and tend to all the time. We look at it every day. We're very conscious about the garden. The interesting thing about the garden is he didn't want to grow it from like already seedlings, like a tomato plant. He wanted to grow it from seeds. He wanted to plant seeds, dig a hole, put seeds in there, see what happens. Well, everything's growing. Nothing has produced fruit yet, although there is one tomato on the vine, so we're very hopeful. One small green tomato on the vine, so we're hopeful. But radishes and cucumbers and tomatoes and snap peas, and the interesting thing about that is he put in a seed. And what is coming up is not a seed. I mean, we know it'll produce a seed. But what is coming up is something completely different, a plant that will bear fruit. That's a resurrection motif in nature, don't you think? I think so, too. The motifs of death and resurrection are entwined. You can't have one without the other, unless a corn of wheat go into the ground and die. You have to have one or the other. Just as day follows night, just as... as life follows death. I got distracted because I was thinking about Catherine's mother. Just as life follows death and day follows light, that's resurrection. And I think the earliest people, C.S. Lewis said this, we are baptized into death. It is the remedy for the fall. Where do we get this? Where do you think ancient people may or may not have gotten this idea? People before reading, people before writing, perhaps. Where may people have gotten this idea? Or maybe the Greeks were the first. Where do you think we see this every day? I think we see resurrection and resurrection motifs every day in nature. Right? In Teddy's garden. Do you remember the Greek myth of Demeter and Persephone? Do you remember that? Demeter this is what the Greeks created to explain how the seasons come, how winter comes and everything, I know it's metaphor, everything dies, or the fall comes and it starts to die, and the winter comes and it does die, and the spring comes and we have hope, and things start to bloom again, and then they become full-fledged, create new things in the summer, and that's the cycle. And this piece of literature, they came up with this idea, how could that be? There was a goddess, Demeter. She was the goddess of the harvest, and she had a daughter named Persephone. Persephone loved nature, and she walked, and everything was beautiful as she walked through nature. And one day, Hades came down from below and created a huge hole in the earth and grabbed and abducted Persephone and dragged her down with him. And Demeter, her mother, the goddess, was very distraught, and things stopped growing because she was so sad. And so Hades and Zeus, the big god, she asked him, please do something for us. They came to a bargain and went down to try to get Persephone back. And the bargain was she can come back to earth and be with her mother for 6 months out of the year, but she has to be down here with Hades, with me, Hades said, for 6 months of the year. There it is, right? So we have 6 months of growth and 6 months of death. The earth itself, the Greeks felt that needed to be explained by movements of the gods. So we know that this is everywhere. We see it all the time. We see it in animals. Yesterday, I was at a Mother's Day event with my grandson, and they had a petting zoo, and we were at my mother's retirement village. It was great. And they had a petting zoo, and there were all sorts of animals, and I thought, well, there was a hedgehog, and we were petting the hedgehog, and I thought, yeah, you hibernate in the winter, along with the bears and the squirrels, I think, hibernate. They die, and then when the weather is warm, they come back to life. So this we see all the time. What about us? What about us human beings? What does this mean for us in literature? What does literature say about this? I'm going to give you a bold, and I want you to question it if you question it. I'd like for you to do that. A bold threefold claim about resurrection and human beings. I'm going to build my talk around this. I do want you to challenge it if you can think of something to challenge it with. Okay, so here it is, a bold threefold claim about resurrection as it has to do with human beings and in literature. Number one, resurrected people, and I'm not talking about truly like in heaven, I'm talking about here on earth, people who have fallen down and gotten back up, people who have been betrayed or have betrayed, better, people who have betrayed and have come back, people who have had something in them die and then come back. Those people act differently than non-resurrected people. I think the scripture supports this. I know that literature supports this, that resurrected people have come back to life and act differently than those that are non-resurrected. Number one. Number two, a person, of course, it's metaphor here, but a person must die before he or she can be reborn or reanimated. And this death, hopefully, well, no, not hopefully. This death will bring one of two things. Either more pride or humility. And that's there's a choice to be made there. When I have betrayed or been betrayed, when I have done whatever, there's a real choice to be made there. And I'll talk a lot about that in just 1 second. Right? So number one, resurrected people act differently than non-resurrected people. Two, a person has to have something die before it can come back, one way or the other. And number three, pride and humility play a huge role. And I contend that pride and humility cannot exist in the same place at the same time. We have to make a choice of how we're going, human beings in literature and us, have to make a choice about how we're going to respond to this. And the choices are many, but at the end of the day, I think they come down to two big ones. Whether I'm going to act humbly, whether the character is going to act humbly, or whether they're going to act in more pride, more hubris. So, here's the literature. I'm going to start with tragedies. The difference between a tragedy and a non-tragedy has to do with this idea of hubris or grand, great pride, right? That's where tragedies in literature come in. Actually, for me, it's the definition of tragedy. At the moment, I am teaching a little clutch of juniors the tragedy of Macbeth. The singers have all gone. Their baccalaureate is today. Their graduation is tomorrow. They left us a couple of weeks ago, and we have been reading the tragedy of Macbeth. Here's a definition. Part of what makes a tragedy is that there's no resurrection of the villain. There's no change after the fall, right? There's no resurrection there, and there's no hope anymore, and that's what makes it a tragedy. At the end of a tragedy, plug up your ears if you don't know how Macbeth finishes. At the end of a tragedy, everybody dies. Everybody dies. Yeah. Sometimes it's their fault. Sometimes it's not their fault. Sometimes they do the stabbing. Sometimes they are the stabbed. But one way or the other, everybody dies. And that's what makes it a tragedy, because there's no resurrection. And that's what Shakespeare and others call, Shakespeare and Sophocles and Homer and others, call a tragic flaw. He or she, and back then mostly he, no offense, but in Macbeth, he, well, no, I'm sorry. No, I'm wrong. In Macbeth, he and she, Mr. and Mrs. Macbeth and Lady Macbeth, have this idea of, do you remember the story? The story is that Macbeth is coming back from war. He's been very successful. He himself has slain these traitors, and he's being hailed as a great guy and everything. And they meet these weird sisters, these three weird sisters, who give this prophecy. You're going to be Thane of Glamis, Thane of Cawdor. You're going to be like, advance. You're also going to be king. Well, Macbeth is not in the line of kings, because back then, and still, there's this law of primogeniture, and so the king's sons become king, and there is a king, and he has two sons. So Macbeth says this in Act 1, or maybe the beginning of Act 2. Macbeth says, in this tragedy, you know what? He has a friend named Banquo. Banquo hears the same message. You're going to be king. So the three weird sisters go away, and Macbeth and Banquo do exactly what people do. That's why literature is so great to read, because good literature tells us exactly what people do. It reports. They're both like, yo, man, did you hear that? You're going to be king. Yeah, and then Banquo got some good prophecies, too. Your sons are going to be kings. And they yuck it up. It's great. And they go on, back, thinking these thoughts. But Macbeth thinks about it, and he's a good guy. And he says, you know what, at the end of Act 1, I wish I hadn't heard that. If chance will have me king, then chance can crown me king, do you remember? Without my stir. Oh, that's good. That's good stuff. That's good stuff. He needs to sit right there and just see what happens. But he doesn't. He doesn't, because hubris gets in there, and he writes a letter to his wife, and she's like, dude, we're going to be king and queen. And when he gets there, he says to her, no, I've decided to fold my hands. I've decided to be a good guy. I've decided to let humility, I've already been raised in the ranks without my stir. I'm just going to keep doing that. And she's like, no, you're not. And they get together, and of course they kill the king. And at the end of it all, Lady Macbeth, and lots of other people, including the king. People come in and say, your wife has died. This is in Act 5. Your wife has died. You know what he says? Everybody dies. That's how far he falls, because of this grand hubris, non-resurrection. And that's important for us, I think, because resurrected people act differently than non-resurrected people. And I could go on, but I'm not going to go on. I could tell you about Othello, who thought that he was just above being mistreated. He didn't do anything wrong until the end. He was mistreated, and he was mistreated by his enemy, because in real life we are mistreated by our enemies. That's what makes them enemies. Otherwise, it'd just be all friends. And that's another life. But not this one. He's mistreated by his enemy, and he just can't believe anybody would do that to him. It's a different kind of pride. But when the time comes and it is revealed what's happened, what he could choose to do is to say, okay, I will listen to reason. But he doesn't, because of this pride. And so he kills everybody, and then, of course, he's killed. And that's a tragedy. So I've made my point about tragedy, and that is this, though, and I think it's a good one. A tragic hero falls always to the tragic flaw of pride. And in that flaw, there's no resurrection in literature. That's important. What brings the resurrection is the opposite of pride, and that is humility. Okay. I have a packet on your table. You don't need it right this minute, but I am in a Wendell Berry phase. Do y'all have this? A small porch. Oh my goodness. Sabbath poems. Yes, Wendell Berry, anyone? He wrote a poem that I teach in a class at school called The Meaning of Life. And the name of the poem, I thought of this late, and it's not in your program. I mean, it's not in your notes. But there's a poem called Manifesto, The Mad Farmer's Liberation Front. And in that poem, Wendell Berry encourages us to, quote, practice resurrection. Isn't that good? Isn't that good? He says in the lines, be like the fox who makes more tracks than necessary, some in the wrong direction. Practice resurrection. The rest of my talk is going to be about that. Practicing resurrection, and those of us and those in literature who have done that. What does it look like to practice resurrection? Can you think of anybody in Scripture, in literature, in your life, who has actually practiced living? And my argument for human beings living in resurrection is that they are different than the normal bear. And that they are trying to practice some form of the opposite of pride in their daily walking. And that's, of course, humility. Something that must die in people, in literature, and in us, in order for humility to come, something must die, and that's pride. It's easy to know what it is. It's pride. Let me give you a couple of people in literature who did that, since that's what I'm tasked to do today. Can you think of anyone? Oh, that's so good. Who said that so I can look at you? Yeah, isn't that good? You know what? It isn't Scrooge. Scrooge, Ebenezer Scrooge. It is not Charles Dickens' fault that we have overproduced the Christmas Carol. You know what I mean? You know, we have merchandised that thing, and that's great, and we go to the play, and it's really great. But it's not Dickens' fault that Scrooge may be a tad bit overdone. That is a great story. In the beginning of that book, he says to the people wanting, oh, it's so good. I didn't write down Scrooge. In the beginning of Christmas Carol, people come knock on his door, and they say, you have a lot of money, would you give to the orphans? You know what he says? Aren't there orphanages? Are there no orphanages? Are there no workhouses? Dude, he doesn't give Marley any time off. But by the end, that's great. He is resurrected. He throws open the curtains. There's the sunshine. He has listened, and then he responds in humility. That is excellent. Yeah, that's great. Anybody else? I can't top that. You win. These are better. Yours are better. Anybody else? Okay, so I'm thinking of a book that you may or may not have read, but I'm a Dostoevsky fan, and so I teach the book Crime and Punishment. In the book Crime and Punishment, we have it's Russian, so the names are, Russian. The protagonist is Raskolnikov. And I won't tell the story completely at all, but what Raskolnikov wants, I love this book so much. Don't tell anybody. I don't always reread page for page every single book I teach, because some of them I just know so well. I even know what page it's on, so it's Act 2, Scene 1. I got it. But I reread Crime and Punishment every year. It's kind of like a practice for me, because Raskolnikov, the villain, is so human, and this is what makes him human. He decides that he can do a sin, and the sin is murder, so it's a big one, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter to this talk, right? He can do what he wants with no consequence. In fact, the name of the book in Russian is better translated Misdeeds and Their Consequence. Now, the problem with that title is it's bad. Nobody's going to buy that in English. Misdeeds and Their Consequences, no one wants to read that, but Crime and Punishment is a good. But a better translation is Doing Bad Stuff and the Consequences of Doing Bad Stuff. And Raskolnikov thinks that he's the one who can get away with it, right? He's the one that can get away with it. And I contend, and Dostoevsky, I think, would agree with my interpretation of his work, I think he would, that we all think that. We all think that. That is the human state, that I am the one. What I'm doing is not that bad. Have you seen him? Have you seen what he's doing? I mean, I'm better than that. In fact, Raskolnikov even wrote an article that was published, and then he forgot about the article. It was published in a little newspaper about the fact that some people are just better than others. He calls them extraordinary and ordinary, but there just really are some people that are just better than others. I mean, we all know this, he says. But in the end of Raskolnikov's journey, the 551 pages of journey, trying to beat the consequences, trying to be the one who can do what he wants without consequence. And again, I say, I totally get it. My sin of choice is speeding down the road on the interstate. My daughter used to live in Illinois, and the speed limit in Illinois at that, she went to college in Illinois, the speed limit at that time was 65. Now, that is terrible. That is terrible because there is a lot of corn between Memphis and Illinois, and you want to get through it as fast as possible. And so I just had in my mind, I can go as fast, I'm not going to go 100 miles an hour, but Larry's asleep, and it's my turn to drive, and I'm not a bank robber. Right? I'm not a murderer like Raskolnikov. I pay my taxes. I'm a good citizen. I say the Pledge of Allegiance. But when I get a ticket from the Illinois police, I'm mad because I think I can outrun the consequences. But sometimes in literature and in A Christmas Carol and in Crime and Punishment, Raskolnikov encounters a woman named Sonia, and she is the picture of grace. The reason she can be almost perfect is because it's literature, and because Dostoevsky wants us to see a really wretched person and a really great person. And so Sonia's forgiving and she's lovely, but she is the picture of grace. And the beauty of that book is, by the end, he verbally they come together, and he verbally abuses her. Oh, I didn't tell you, she is a prostitute, so she's the lowest on the scale of like local people. She's the lowest person. And Dostoevsky gives us the prostitute as the vehicle of grace. And Raskolnikov is mean to her. He shuns her. He verbally abuses her. He tells her that she's terrible, all these things. And she just stays. Now, this is not a talk about proper relationship behavior. This is a talk about fiction. But Grace just stays. And eventually, at the end of the book, this is how it reads at the very end of the book. Sonia and Raskolnikov, at the end, he finally gets caught. He finally goes to Siberia. He goes to Siberia, and he's still mad. He still looks all around and says, everybody here is a criminal, and I'm kind of smarter and better than everybody. He does that the whole time. He never does turn until page 550. It's true. And then that persistence of grace that Sonia just keeps coming and won't go away. Finally, he just breaks. And the line reads like this. It's pretty great. Raskolnikov and Sonia, their faces full of resurrection and new life, even life in Siberia. It's going to take Raskolnikov a minute to lay down that pride because it keeps cropping up, but he does do it. And so that story is a good one because it shows that what can break down pride is consistent grace. How am I doing on time? I'm okay. Here's one. Anyone ever read, speaking of Dickens, anyone ever read A Tale of Two Cities? That's a great book. I used to teach it. I'm not teaching it right now. Do you remember the story of A Tale of Two Cities? Because it's fiction, you can create the characters that you want. So there are two characters in the book who look alike. Two men who look alike. Sidney Carton is the name of one. Charles Darnay is the name of the other. And they look just alike, kind of like twins. It's unusual, but it happens. Well, they're foils of one another. And what that means is that Charles Darnay is rich, and he has a good job, and he is a good citizen, and he gets the girl, and he is a wonderful human being. He really is. He's good and a good guy and whatever. And Sidney Carton is kind of just a lump. He's a louse. He doesn't do his job well. No one likes him. He stays up and drinks all night long, and he sleeps all day, and they're foils of one another. They're different. But they both fall in love with the same girl. Well, I don't have to tell you, in fiction, and probably in real life too, the girl chooses what she sees as the better man. She chooses Charles Darnay. Well, Sidney Carton is moved by this love that he feels. It's genuine. He feels this love. And so he goes to her and tells her. And this is humility. He's just been a louse the whole time. But about midway through the book, or kind of towards the end, he goes to her and he says, look, I know that you love Charles Darnay. And that's a good choice. That's the better choice. But I love you. And I would do anything. That's humility. I would do anything for you or one you love. And she receives that. She doesn't love him romantically in return, but she receives that, and there's this beautiful moment where they hold hands and part ways and everything. Well, late in the book, Charles Darnay, do you remember? Charles Darnay gets arrested. It's during the time of the protest of the peasants in the French Revolution, or just past the post-French Revolution. But anyway, in France, and he goes over there and he gets arrested. So Sidney Carton, who remembers years before and still loves Lucy, remembers what he said, I would do anything for you and one you love. Now you know what he did. He gets on a boat, goes to France, or however you get to France from England. A boat. Goes to France, finds Charles, it's a long story, but finds Charles Darnay, gets access to the prison, goes in there and changes, this one gets me because it's like Christ. Changes places with Charles Darnay. He brings in this drug, like ether or something, to make him go to sleep, because he knows Charles Darnay won't do it. He won't change places. Takes his coat off, puts his coat on, leaves Charles Darnay there. Takes Charles Darnay out and substitutionarily, is that a word, puts himself in another's place. He lived up to his promise. He lived up to the love. He was terrible, but then he was wonderful. And he goes, in place of Charles Darnay, for love, to the guillotine. And this is where this most famous line is. And this is where the resurrection is. He says, you know it, don't you? It is a far, far better thing that I do than I have ever done. And that's true. It is a far, far better rest that I go to than I have ever known. Oh, I used to teach ninth grade way back, and we taught it back then. And everybody's crying, I'm crying. And because, you know why we're all crying? Because we know that to be right. In our belly, we know that to be right. And what Lucy did afterwards is the resurrection part. So that's the substitutionary death part. What Lucy did was had a baby and named him Sidney Carton. And every year they would go to his grave, and on it was a far, far better. I think I made that part up. I think she remembered that he said, it is a far, far better thing that I do. And then that Sidney Carton had a baby, grew up and had a baby, named him Sidney Carton. Because Dickens believed in resurrection. And we get to resurrection in literature, and in real life, I think, only through the death of pride. And so we got to kill that, or try, or think about it, or want to, so that the beautiful seeds of humility can grow in their place. I'm just doing okay on time, so let me see what else I've got here. Oh, can you do one more? Can we do one? Anybody else have one? Scrooge just went straight to the top. So anybody else? An idea of resurrection in literature? Oh, well. Oh. I know. That one. Pardon? Oh, yeah, that's right. Les Miserables. Javert and Jean Valjean. You got to love Javert in that book because he is us. He can't stand that grace. He just can't stand it. You don't deserve it. You're a thief. Doesn't matter to the law. doesn't matter to the law that he just stole a loaf of bread because everybody was hungry. He stole it for his family. I don't care about that. That's pride. You broke the law. You pay for what you did. Yes, that we need that. We have to have that. But there's no room for, so good, for Javert, there is no room for grace. And so, in the end of it, I saw it on stage. Have you seen it on stage? In the end, he can't, Javert so cannot tolerate grace that he ends up taking his own life. If it can't be, I can't think of anybody more prideful, maybe, that would say, if it can't be the way I think it is supposed to be, then I am not interested. In this book, Brothers Karamazov, there's a character. There's three brothers, and Dmitri, Ivan, and Alyosha. Ivan is the middle brother, and he is the mind. Oh, it's so cool. Dimitri's the body. This the three parts of personhood: the body, mind, and spirit. And Dmitri is the body. Ivan is the mind. It's logic. And then Alyosha, the priest, is the spirit. Anyway, at one point, Ivan is faced with that same thing. The faith of his brother, his little brother who can't explain himself because he's only 19, but he knows he has faith and he knows he loves God and he wants to be a priest. And the brother, the mind just beats him all the way through. But at one point, Ivan can't stand the grace. And he says, if that's the way, there's this whole big speech about Jesus, because Alyosha is a priest. And so he tells this whole thing about the life of Christ and resurrection and grace. And Ivan says, if that's the way it is, I return my ticket. I love that phrase. I don't know what it is in Russian, but that is a great phrase in English. I'm out. I return my ticket. I don't want any part of that. I guess the teacher in me would stop there. The preacher in me says, what about me? What about me? You know, what's my limit? Where will I say, yeah, I'll forgive a lot, but I will not forgive that? Because you don't deserve it. And our characters in literature who do that are called tragic heroes. The heroes because they were the main person. But the tragic flaw is, I have my limits. Well, that's what Javert said. That's what Ivan Karamazov said. No resurrection. No resurrection. If I can't explain it, I will not do it. I'll give you one more, and then maybe we'll actually look at some of this poetry I brought. I brought it for Catherine because she loves poetry. So you'll have to tell her I brought poetry, but never got to it. I think we'll get to a couple. I also teach a book called East of Eden by John Steinbeck. I love that book. And what we have in there is a husband and wife duo. It's not a complicated book. You should read it. You could read it like without help. It is a good book. But it's really a Cain and Abel story set in California in the 1850s, 60s, 70s, right in there. So it's really Cain and Abel. Brother kills brother. But the Abel character is named Adam, which is interesting because Adam has his own motif in religious thinking. He ends up marrying a woman named Kathy. And what's interesting about this marriage is that he is potentially, he has the potential for humility, and she absolutely does not. She is a villain. She is introduced, when she's first introduced by the author, she's introduced as a monster. And the girls all try to, when I teach it, the girls all try to diagnose. Oh, she's this, oh, she's that. Let's just let her be what she is. She is a monster, and she does monstrous things. Midway through the book, she tries to kill him, she runs away, she does all these terrible, terrible things. And he finally sits down. He's got all this money. His father left a lot of money. He has plenty of money. He's got this big farm out in California. He wants to plant a garden. His name is Adam. So he wants to have an Eve. He married her too quickly. He didn't know her. That's not important to this conversation today. And she tries to kill him, and then she runs away. And now he's got this garden. He's got Eden and no Eve to share it with. So what he does is he sits down on his porch. He has a person who helps him clean and cook, and he's got these children, and this person named Lee is a Chinese person, a man named Lee, takes care of the boys, and he sits down in a chair and for 11 years. He just sits down. He just sits down. He doesn't. He's mad. He's sad. He doesn't take care of his children. He's got someone taking care of his children, but he just sits down and says, "If this is the way it is, this is so us. Isn't this us? If this is the way it is, then I'm just going to sit down. I got plenty of money. I got somebody to take care of the house and the garden and everything, and I'm just going." And he did. He really just sat there all day, and then he'd go to bed, and then he'd get up the next day and sit, and he sometimes wandered around, but mostly he just sat there and didn't plant and didn't harvest and didn't do anything. And finally a friend comes by from earlier in the book and says to him, "What are you doing?" The boys are 11 years, twin boys. Twin boys. It's a Cain and Abel story. "What are you doing? Why are you just sitting here?" And he said, "Their mother left them motherless." And she did. And you know what the friend whose name is Samuel, the name of a prophet, you know what he said? Well, let me act it out because I'm interrupting too much. Adam says, "Yes, I'm sitting here because their mother ran away. Their mother left them motherless." And Samuel looks at him and said, "Yes, and you have left them fatherless. Get up." It's a Western kind. It's set out in California. He says, "I will not get up." I do not recommend this behavior. Steinbeck is responsible. Picks him up and hits him right in the nose. And Adam falls down. And he gets back up and he says, "Well, what about still making excuses for his own behavior of just sitting there dead?" Dead. She tried to kill him. And so he didn't die, but he allowed himself to be dead for 11 years. And finally, Samuel hits him in the nose, and then he gets him, picks him back up, and he shakes him, because it's like cowboys and stuff, shakes him and says, Adam says, still trying to make excuses, but, Samuel hits him again. Kind of like Samuel with David, right? I do not think that the prophet, it was Samuel, right? I do not think that it was, right? Samuel, who encountered David about Bathsheba. Was that Samuel? Yeah, was it? Nathan. Good, sorry. Nathan. And tells that story to David after he's been with Bathsheba, and then Uriah has died, and the baby is eventually going to die. Anyway, you can tell this is off the cuff, so sorry. Tells a story about a sheep. David's just sitting there mad. How could anybody do this? How could anybody kill a pet sheep or lamb? I'm going to get that person. And Nathan says, "Dude, it's you." What happens to us in literature and in real life when the Lord, or I'll stick with that, when God brings people into our lives or allows circumstances to happen to us where somebody looks at us, or we know, or a policeman looks at us if you're speeding, and says, "Dude, it's you. It's you." That moment in literature and life, that moment is very, very important. And in literature, we have so many characters who say, "I don't care." Okay, but that's the tragedy. That's it. And we have so many characters who say, "Oh, it is me." That shift to humility is the resurrection, isn't it? Okay. What did I not get to a lot? Y'all are great. I tell you what, let's look at a couple of these poems real quickly. And then I'll close. Yeah, let's look at the second one on the front page. It's Wendell from a small porch from this book. It's number 4. I really like this. "Having carried them within her 5 months and labored hard to set them free, the fierce old woman finds her lambs wet from her womb, breathing the cold air, struggling on the soiled bedding on the world's floor to live. And she calls to them in a loud, muttering gutturals of praise, her absolute eloquence of joy. For they, here it is, for they who once were not, were nothing, now are something new, themselves, her own. And her joy is at one with all joy this world has known, for the one reason, the life that was not, now is. Life. From death, from nothing, something new is born. That's what resurrection looks like in literature. That's when Scrooge goes to bed and says, I don't care about the orphans. I don't care. I have earned this, and I'm going to keep it. And then his heart is touched, and something new happens. Isn't that what we want? Isn't that what we want from the television shows that we watch, from the people that we know? Isn't that what you want for your children and your grandchildren and your neighbor and your spouse? And all I'm suggesting, all the literature is suggesting, I think, is that we should want that for ourselves as well. The difference between righteousness and self-righteousness is an important place. You know, I think that part of what righteousness means is right living with others. I got that from someone other than myself. Right living with other people. Watch. That's so good. That's so good. But you just don't know my husband. Have you met my mother-in-law? I wrote it down. I wrote down it. Self-righteous people, and I'll close with this. Self-righteous people feel that they have a leg up on others. Raskolnikov was self-righteous. He just thought he was better than everybody else. If we think we're better than even one person, which I think we all, surely, I may be the only sinner in the room, but I think we all have that one person who we're just like, yeah, but that one. I'd do great if she weren't here. If she didn't exist, I would do better. Self-righteous people feel they have a leg up on others, and their focal point is to make others feel inferior. They always have to feel like they know what is best. Self-righteous people are quick to blame and to condemn. They are habitually critical of others and judge them severely. That's the tragic hero. Macbeth, I can kill you because I'm just better than you. You're in my way. But righteousness requires humility and saying, yes, I know that person in my life is difficult and probably really may not ever change. So now what? And this literature, and so much good literature, reflects that there is something to do there. And that is to show grace to the ungracious, love the unlovely. It's easier to do when we don't know the unlovely, when they come for dinner or when they come for, when my husband helps at MIFO, and so that's easy. And it's wonderful. But I don't know anybody. That's great work. But also, I don't know you. You don't irritate me because I don't know you. But if I knew you and you irritated me, what then? I think I've overstayed my welcome. Any questions or comments? Or you guys, you well-read folk? You?
Anyone? I have a lot of questions and comments, but I'm going to let them have. I love this idea of, so in our grand story, as Christians and Jews, sin brings death, and what you said, hubris, is denying that applies to me.
I think so.
One of those, like at least in Crime and Punishment.
Yeah.
Like I'm above that.
Yeah.
But when that dies, that hubris dies, it's almost simultaneous resurrection, it sounds like.
Yes.
Where does the choice come in? I'm interested in choice. Sometimes resurrection in that process seems like it's something that happens to us. But there's a choice in there somewhere.
There's a choice
or the
in
response.
there. There is. So with Raskolnikov in particular, he took grace for granted, grace in the form of this woman, Sonia, who had gone with him. That's an important point. He gets convicted and goes to Siberia. The whole time he's there, he's looking down on everybody, all these criminals. He talks about all these criminals all the time. To make it personal, just real quickly, my mother's brother, my uncle, was an alcoholic, and he never did recover. And he lived here in missions, the Calvary mission, the Union Mission, thank you. Lived on the street. We helped him. It never worked. Anyway, he finally ended up in a mission in Jackson, Mississippi. And he was a good cook and a chef, and he worked there until he died. And we could go visit him there. But he would call my mother, his sister, every single month and say, these people here are terrible. These people here, I'm so much better than they. I mean, I'm so much smarter than they are. I'm leaving here. I'm leaving here. And she would talk him, no, please stay, please stay, please stay. Yeah, so the choice is to, well, back to Raskolnikov real quickly. Sonia went with him to Siberia and came every day and sat with them and wrote letters and she, it got too good at the end. She baked cookies for the other prisoners and stuff like that. But one day, she got sick, and she didn't come. And she was gone for a week. And during that time, when Sonia was gone for that week, and she didn't come, and of course, there's no texting or anything, so no one told, and he's a prisoner, so no one told him where she was, he realized that grace might go away. Now, theologically, the grace doesn't go away. But in the novel, that grace could go away. She might die. And he said, brought to that brink, he said, I choose it. And he has an ending a little bit like Sidney Carton, it is a far, far better thing I do. The very last lines are, I need to be renewed. I need to be a better man. I need to do some work of great kindness, a work of great humility. That's how it ends. So I do think King David had a choice. Everyone has a choice when we're confronted with that hubris to either say, yeah, but I really am better than you. I mean, or to choose humility, which grows into a tree of life.
That's so good because I think raise your hand if you got a question. Got one more. But I just think that's so important because we usually think that the grain falls into the ground. Oh, we have to let the thing die and something precious is going to die. Like my favorite thing, God wants my favorite thing to die. But when you really locate it in that way, we can see that the hubris is the thing between the person and the new life.
Well, it's just like Adam and Eve. I mean, you can have everything.
Until you let go.
Just not this one thing, and they're like, yeah, we're going to take that anyway. I want the one thing. That pride, yeah.
I want to make one comment.
Good.
Your definition of resurrection strikes me as real. It reminds me of a time of life that I wanted resurrection too. And I will mention something that you haven't said. It may not be significant to anybody else. But my resurrection began with forgiveness.
Yes.
From the person who needed to forgive me.
So that's helpful.
That's another
forgiveness
whole,
and resurrection.
And that's another, I have it down here, but that is another whole, I talk to girls a lot about forgiveness at school and in my English classes. And they always say the same thing. Yeah, but, well, I'll stop there. Yeah. Yeah, but, and I get it. Because that person doesn't deserve it. That person really did do that thing. He is not going to change any. And my dad is the worst. And that may all be true. But not forgiving, I wrote it down here, and I said, dare I speak of the F word? Not forgiving is a prideful act. I look at you and I say, not you. And so if we're going to choose to not forgive, which I think is a choice, then we have to say, well, I'm choosing that you are keeping me from fully resurrecting into what I could be without the hatred or without the scorn or the derision or whatever it is I feel toward you. Because that's not good. Everyone knows that. And the oddest thing about forgiveness is that the person who has hurt me so much of the time either doesn't know it or doesn't care. Well, okay. And so I spend my life caring and angry and become an old, bitter old woman over someone who just does not care about that. I don't want to do that. I want to see what grows out of that place where I let that scorn die. I want to see what that is, yeah.
Thank you, Sherry.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all. What a rich, rich time.
My pleasure.
So grateful.
Thank you.
Can you come back next week and do it again?
Yes.
Okay, let's do it again next week. No, I don't know who's next week, actually. Oh, yes, I do. We're going to talk about our projects, how things are going to flow from here, and why we're doing this, and also how it's going to work. So thank you all. Go in peace.